blind preacher steps off a guild ship and says he has been summoned by a power greater than the Atreides. The line is easy to dismiss as mystic theater. But in Dune, that claim points to something real. Forces above any throne, moving people who technically command armies. The scene is a clue, not a flourish. It tells us the story's visible rulers live inside an invisible net. What mattered here was the network that made his return possible. The Spacing Guild delivered him under bonded agreement. That phrase sounds bureaucratic, but it means law plus dependence. The Guild's monopoly on safe interstellar travel gives it leverage over princes, regents, and smugglers alike. In practice, no one crosses a Guild contract without gambling the logistics of their entire life. A throne can command a planet. A monopoly can immobilize an empire. That difference will echo through everything that follows. The preacher's answer unsettles, because it reframes power as a system. A prince asks, "Who summons you?" The reply names no faction. Instead, it points past personalities to the machinery that actually governs. That detail reveals Dune's central paradox. Authority is theatrical until it becomes logistical. Once food, fuel, and futures depend on a supply chain, charisma must negotiate with constraints. We are going to map those constraints. 4 interlocking systems run Herbert's universe. First, a material choke point. Spice. The melange is not just a drug. It is the fuel for prescient navigation, the stimulant that stretches lifespans and awareness, and the commodity that organizes risk across worlds. Second, a set of religious scripts, seated beliefs and emergent faiths that mobilize masses and legitimize rulers. Third, imperial cartel institutions, the Landsraad of great houses, the CHOAM combine of profit shares, and the guild's travel monopoly. And fourth, long horizon planning cultures, people who turn centuries into an instrument, culminating in Leto II's Golden Path. Each system solves a problem that otherwise would break the empire. Spice solves navigation risk by allowing limited prescience. Religion solves coordination and meaning under uncertainty by supplying scripts that bind people to causes. Institutions solve the need for predictable profit and arbitration among rivals. Long horizon planning solves the brittleness that accumulates when success freezes adaptation. The important point is not just what each does, but how they lock together and push back when anyone tries to dominate. Consider spice first, because everything else sits on it. Interstellar travel is chaos without a way to see probable futures. The guild discovered that saturating navigators with melange lets them glimpse branching paths and steer safely. That dependency is total. If spice stops, ships stop. If ships stop, economies seize, and armies become provincial militias. This helps explain why control of Arrakis looks like absolute power, and yet keeps disappointing those who seize it. On paper, owning the spice planet is a universal key. In practice, the planet will not obey paper. Sandworms make extraction dangerous and seasonal. Fremen knowledge makes it survivable. Ecology places hard limits on safe overuse. Each of those details says the same thing. A resource monopoly remains a negotiation with the environment and its stewards. What appeared to be a single lever becomes an ecosystem of negotiations that can go wrong in different ways. Religion and myth scripts come next. The Bene Gesserit seeded beliefs across the galaxy through their missionaria protectiva, a long campaign to plant usable prophecies. That tool exists because real coordination under threat requires fast justification. If a population already expects a certain sign, a leader can step into that shape and move them. But the cost appears later. Emergent faiths do not stay within the narrow channel their authors intended. Muad'Dib's religion surged beyond design and carried the jihad with it. That blowback is the recurring tax on anyone who treats belief as a lever. We can see how other houses read this. In Children of Dune, House Corrino strategists quip that the Landsraad and CHOAM will go where the prophet goes, and they talk about drowning the Fremen. in their Muad'Dib's religion. The tone is cynical, but the diagnosis is sound. Profit-driven bodies aligned with proven returns, and mass belief can blunt resistance. The real gap lies between using belief and surviving it. Even Corrino envoys feel uneasy about embracing a faith that might remake their own base. This brings us to the imperial cartel structure. The Landsraad is a council of great houses that balances imperial ambition through collective threat. CHOAM, the Combine Honate Ober-Advancer Mercantiles, is a profit-sharing trust that keeps nobles invested in stability, and the guild stands apart as logistics incarnate, i.e., together they are a fence around ambition. A ruler rules within their frame, or stops being a ruler. That is why every successful sovereign in Dune learns to treat profit, passage, and prestige as the real currencies of command. There is another pattern Herbert gives us to read these ambiguities. The preacher recalls Lady Jessica's instruction to differentiate between the wolf and the dog, and then adds that dawn period, when you cannot tell the difference. That metaphor matters. Early in any regime change, the behaviors of protectors and predators can look similar. You centralize force, impose discipline, and demand loyalty. The question is what happens when the sun is fully up. In other words, legitimate power and abusive control are hard to separate while consolidation is underway. That ambiguity is not accidental. It is a feature of systems where survival requires assertiveness. Herbert roots it through personal images, but the logic is institutional. The Landsraad tolerates wolves so long as they hunt other wolves. CHOAM applauds dogs who guard the granary until grain prices fall. Faith forgives excess if the story says the end is holy. Each domain has its own threshold. Cross it, and support flips to resistance. We need one more image to hold in mind while we move across centuries: the planet's memory. The preacher describes it as layers of rock, dirt, sediment, and sand. That picture tells us something practical about power. Choices harden. Policies, propaganda, and built environments accumulate into terrain that later leaders must cross. When Arrakis is pushed toward a greener ecology, that is not just a scene change. It is a structural rewrite of power, because fewer worms mean less spice, and less spice means a weaker guild and hungrier cartels. Herbert is writing against the comfort of permanence. Empires want to believe the ground is fixed. Humans crave a story that the present order will hold if its symbols endure. Prescience seems to answer that craving. See the future, dodge the worst branches, and maybe keep what you love. But in Dune, prescience carries its own trap. Once futures are known, people cling to the safest path, and adaptation stalls. The important point is that certainty can become a cage, and cages rust when the world changes. This is why long horizon planning shows up as both salvation and menace. The Bene Gesserit breed for traits that will survive crisis. The guild bets its survival on keeping spice flowing and roots stable. Paul Atreides tries to steer the jihad scale through vision, only to learn that a leash on a tidal wave is still a drowning rope. And then Leto II takes the logic farther. He promises Kralizek, the storm of storms, and declares he will shatter the empire. He speaks of hidden stockpiles and a secret place beneath the desert, and of new powers rising when the monopoly fades. He is not being theatrical, he is converting time into a discipline. That mid-course correction, the deliberate breakage of the spice monopoly, is not a pure power grab. It is a design to disperse control across interlocking communities, so no single faction can capture civilization again. He plans for scarcity shocks to force trade patterns to decentralize. He uses religion to fuse obedience to a purpose that outlasts his body. He manipulates institutions so the habit of cartel politics survives, but not the ease of capture. In practice, he weaponizes constraints. If that sounds abstract, bring it back to the preacher's summons and a simple signal. Duncan, Idaho hears a call that only Paul should know. The moment cuts through masks because it uses the operating system itself, a code built into a relationship, leveraged inside a guild guarantee, circulating in a world wired by shared faith in Muad'Dib. Truth is authenticated not by proclamation, but by alignment with the system's memory. That is what summons people in Dune. Not mystical compulsion, but a mesh of meanings and obligations that feel stronger than commands. Seen this way, House Corrino's aside about profit going where profit goes is not cynicism. It is a map of constraint. CHOAM aligns with winners because markets price risk and reward. The guild enforces contracts because breaking them endangers the fabric of travel itself. Fremen resist cooptation because their belief scripts were written in the desert's grammar of scarcity and honor. Each actor obeys its own survival logic, and each logic limits everyone else. What happens when someone misreads that landscape? Herbert gives us 3 kinds of blowback. First, jihad-level mobilization, when belief is treated as a stage prop. That is how prophecy becomes a war. Second, ecological shock, when planners ignore the planet's memory. Rework the desert too well, and you starve the worms that feed your empire. Third, imperial collapse, when institutions are bent past their breaking point. Over-centralize and the cartel resists you. Undermine the guild, and you strand your allies. This helps explain why the throne is not the system. The throne sits at the intersection of constraints and claims. It can amplify, but it cannot invent gravity. In other words, a ruler who does not grasp spice logistics, scripture dynamics, cartel arithmetic, and times-long pressure ends up pushed by them. The ruler who does understand them reshapes incentives rather than symbols. Across this series, we will move from the most tangible constraints to the most temporal. We will start with spice, extraction, distribution, and the addiction that makes it non-optional for navigators and elites. Then we will turn to religion, seeded myths, emergent faith, and the mechanics of mobilization. From there, we will map the institutions, how the Landsraad votes, how CHOAM shares, and how the guild prices risk. Finally, we will sit with the long planners, why the Golden Path breaks the monopoly, and what a distributed order looks like after Kralizak. At each step, we will return to the same question. If no faction truly controls Dune, what actually governs outcome? The answer we will build is that power is a system of constraints and feedbacks. Durable control does not come from seizing a symbol, but from shaping the levers that others must pull to function. That is what a power greater than the Atreides sounds like when spoken in plain terms. Before we move on, hold the wolf and dog dawn in mind. It is tempting to call early consolidators wolves and be done with it. But Herbert warns that legitimacy and abuse can share moves when the sun is low. The test comes after consolidation. Do institutions thicken? Do beliefs moderate into law? Do resources get stewarded rather than stripped? Those answers tell you what kind of animal you are dealing with. This helps explain why Paul's reign, despite charisma, could not halt the jihad's momentum, and why Leto II forces a harsher discipline to reset the conditions for survival. Also hold the planet's memory. When we later watch Arrakis' ecology shift, we are not just admiring a new landscape. We are watching constraints migrate. Fewer worms means less spice. Less spice means a weaker guild and a CHOAM that must find other rents. New settlements mean new local elites with different loyalties. That cascade is the system doing what it always does, pushing back on anyone who believed the present arrangement would last, because it was grand. If this sounds demanding, it should. Herbert wrote a universe where the stakes of misreading systems are total. That is why the preacher's line keeps ringing. He is not posturing. He is reminding a prince that he lives inside a lattice that does not care about titles. A bonded agreement can move him. A faith can shield him or expose him. A profit calculus can tolerate him or starve him. and time can collect his decisions into a sediment of outcomes that defines the next generation's choices. So our task in this first chapter is not to answer every question, but to set the frame. We have named the four systems. We have seen how they interlock and why they resist capture. We have felt the ambiguity of consolidation and the hardening of past choices into terrain. We have glimpsed why prescience tempts and why it enslaves, and we have previewed the one ruler who will treat time as a tool rather than a forecast. From here, we will start with the bloodstream of the Empire, spice. We will ask simple questions that open deeper ones. How is it extracted without being destroyed? Who sets the flows, and to whom do they answer? What does dependency do to the minds and markets that need it? And where are the risks that a throne cannot order away? Those answers will begin to show why even a triumphant house on Arrakis finds itself negotiating with sand. Begin with the chain. Sandworms turn a harsh desert metabolism into melange. Melange turns a human brain into a guidance instrument. That instrument turns deep space from guesswork into scheduled commerce. And scheduled commerce turns a planetary fief into something that looks like an empire. What matters here is that each link constrains the next, which is why no ruler can just command the spice and expect obedience to follow. On Arrakis, ecology is not a backdrop. It is a factory. Sandroots seal moisture, sands shift with storms, and somewhere within that long cycle, spice blows mark where melange reaches the surface. Extraction depends on timing around worm sign, because the worm protects the cycle that produces spice. In practice, a harvester is a trespasser on a predator's hunting ground, so logistics begin with survival, not with quotas. This helps explain the distinctive mining routine. Big factory crawlers chew at spice beds, with carrioles poised overhead to lift them when a worm approaches. Ornithopters scout, thumpers distract, and every minute on the sand is a calculation against risk. The system on Arrakis evolved as a three-mode choreography: on foot and pallet for groundwork, suspensor lift for weight, and thopter for speed, because nothing fixed to the ground survives long. The ecology forced mobility, and mobility shaped the schedule. That detail reveals the first operating rule of spice power. If you cannot move on time, you cannot extract, and if you cannot extract, no one travels. The Spacing Guild navigators require melange to achieve the limited prescience that guides ships through folded space. Without those specialized minds, the Empire's supply chains collapse into blind jumps. So a biology problem in a desert becomes a finance and governance problem light years away. Guild dependence is not a rumor. It is built into the job. Navigators saturate themselves in spice until their cognition reorients around probabilistic futures. Addiction here is not just habit. It is a professional requirement that becomes a political constraint. Because only spice enables that navigation, the navigators themselves become the Empire's narrowest bottleneck. The entire economy must pass through a few altered minds. That is why the Guild polices neutrality with quiet ferocity. They do not pick winners in a feud. They slow or price the transports that decide the feud's duration. They enforce a stance that looks like withdrawal, but it functions as leverage. If they stop moving troops, a claimant's momentum fades. If they hike rates, a campaign burns its treasury twice as fast. No speech from a throne can compensate for grounded ships. We get hard evidence of this leverage in the Harkonnen ledgers. When the Baron snarls that transporting the Sardaukar strike force costs so much that even 60 years of squeezing Arrakis would barely repay it, he is not exaggerating for theater. He is admitting that the Guild's monopoly can blackmail houses through simple invoices. The important point is not just the price. It is the way price becomes permission. There is a deeper reason for Guild caution around Arrakis. When navigators warned the Bene Gesserit that they were bothered about the future, they were describing a prescient fog, a nexus where tiny movements on the spice world could spiral into catastrophes they could not chart. That tells us why the guild never simply seized the source. Their prescience showed them that any direct move on the desert tipped them into a blindness they could not price. Historians of this universe often borrow a phrase from our own. This is a hydraulic despotism, where control of the flow becomes control of the polity. Petroleum once traveled in pipelines that magnified the power of those who held the valves. Early electrical grids did the same with copper and current. In Dune, the valve is a convoy of carrioles, and the flow is melange. Whoever times, protects, or pauses that flow wields a power beyond their head count. CHOAM, Combine Honete Oberadvancer Mercantiles, sits at the other end of this pipeline. It is not a ministry, it is a cartelized equity club for the great houses and the throne. CHOAM advances ventures, distributes dividends, and tallies profits from everything. But the crown jewel is spice. Because every household shares, every house has cash flow skin in the game of stability. That is how a cartel of enemies stays invested in the same piece. This works because CHOAM does two things at once. It socializes the risk of shipping and extraction by paying houses for participating capital, and it disciplines overreach by threatening dividend collapse if a war chokes trade. The incentive is subtle but strong. You might hate a rival's banner, but your treasury loves their shipping lane. That is how profit-sharing turns feuds into lawsuits rather than sieges, until someone misreads the constraint and reaches for the wrong lever. On the ground of Fremen hold the lever that most outsiders underrate, the cost of extraction. Local ecological mastery starts with still suits and science shelters, but politically, it matures into control of when a harvester can work in peace. A sandstorm forecast, a worm diverted late, a patrol ambushed at the edge of a spice bed. Each is a tiny delay with compounding effects. That is how a desert culture taxes an empire without minting coins. Guerrilla mobility is the amplifier. Riding worms grants unmatched range across dunes that swallow heavy armor. It allows Fremen bands to appear at the moment a carryall is committed, when the machine cannot both lift and defend. This is not romantic color. It is a tactical fact that channels the politics of extraction into insurgent leverage. In practice, a dozen people can pause a district's spice flow for days, and the price chart in a distant exchange will translate that pause into panic. That panic is predictable because spice demand is almost perfectly inelastic. The aging process slows under steady doses. Navigators need it to work. Elites inhale it for memory and longer life. When a good produces dependence and status at the same time, people hoard as soon as they sense scarcity. Hoarding removes supply from circulation, which worsens scarcity. The curve steepens, and a small disruption becomes a market shock. This helps explain why a quiet embargo can coerce an emperor more efficiently than a battlefield threat. If the guild delays sailings, CHOAM revenue falls, dividends shrink, and the coalition that props up the throne gets nervous. If the Fremen choke harvests, navigators lose confidence in their own futures, and their pricing turns punitive. The emperor may still have garrisons, but their payroll rides the same ships and draws from the same revenues. Spice is also a calendar. It schedules how far into the future the powerful can think. A navigator on heavy melange can hold multiple future branches long enough to plan multi-year routes reliably. A house with guaranteed allotments can fund ventures with long maturation horizons. Remove that certainty, and horizons collapse. People shift from investing in decades to surviving quarters, and an empire built on patient exploitation becomes an empire of emergency measures. In other words, spice does not only move ships, it paces decisions. Prescience narrows the variance on outcomes, which makes credit cheaper and alliances more credible. Cut the flow, and the variance returns. Suddenly, partners demand collateral, vassals ask for guarantees, and every plan must include a contingency for not arriving on time. That ambient doubt is the real cost of a shortage. Leto II names the endpoint of this logic with unsettling clarity. He speaks of a secret place with the greatest treasure of all time beneath the desert. He also promises that as the power of the spice monopoly fades and the hidden stockpiles make their mark, new powers will appear. Set the rhetoric aside and we have a policy thesis. See, concentrated flow creates fragile monopolies. Diffused stockpiles create distributed bargaining power. That line about new powers flags a design choice, not just a prophecy. If stockpiles are real and the monopoly can be cracked, then the map of leverage shifts from a single production node to many reserve nodes. The guild's bottleneck stops being absolute. CHOAM's dividend engine encounters new shareholders in practice, if not on paper. The Fremen's local veto becomes one of several regional vetoes. In short, scarcity is not abolished. It is relocated. There is another way Leo's comment about interlocking communities matters. He frames survival as a pattern of communities that understand their dependencies and work together in the common design. That sounds abstract, but it is a critique of how the Empire learned to think. For generations, the powerful treated spice like a hoardable substance. Leto treats it more like a circuit, where stability comes from how the pieces interact rather than who holds the switch. Before that reframing takes hold, however, the imperial economy deepens its dependence. Some analysts in-universe even speculate that Leto would push dependency higher first, perhaps by tying more of life and health to melange. Aging already slows with steady doses, which means the most risk-averse and long-lived stakeholders are exactly the ones who fear shortage the most. In a hydraulic regime, that fear can be harnessed or weaponized. Notice how each faction chooses a spice pathway that becomes a cage. The guild drinks prescience and cannot risk a move that clouds it. CHOAM counts dividends and becomes hostage to peace. Great houses chase longer lives and richer memories, then wake to find their elite class medically addicted. The Fremen weaponize mobility, then must decide whether political victory would destroy the ecology that makes them powerful. Each strategy roots through melange and inherits its risks. The market dynamics magnify these traps. When prices climb, CHOAM's impulse is to protect revenue by rationing to its biggest shareholders first. That seems rational, but it concentrates pain on smaller players who then defect to alternatives, smuggling, local substitution, or revolt. Meanwhile, the guild raises transport fees to cover perceived risk, which cascades into higher end prices for everyone. In practice, scarcity inflames the very behaviors that worsen it. That is why even a paused flow can remake maps. Imagine a week when carryalls lift half as many harvesters. Guild spot rates spike. CHOAM auctions thin. A ducal council delays a vote because a key patron did not arrive. A Bene Gesserit plan stalls for lack of a courier. None of these look like battles, but together they change who has momentum. Logistics curates history by deciding who can act in time. The Fremen again sit at the hinge of time and terrain. Their intimate weather sense and their ability to move without external support let them set the rhythm of extraction. This does not require total conquest of the desert. It requires selectively making operations unreliable. A mine that cannot depend on tomorrow. That is why a CH can remain hidden and still command events far away. In a world governed by prescience, unreliability is its own weapon. Navigators need a future smooth enough to pick safe paths. If Arrakis produces noise, storms out of season, raids that force last-minute lifts, the future fuzzes. The guild interprets fuzz as danger and prices it accordingly. That price lands in a CHOAM ledger and then in a house budget. The supply chain converts Fremen choices into imperial arithmetic. All of this looks tidy until ecology moves. Start changing Arrakis, introduce surface water, stabilize dunes, and the worm cycle breaks. Fewer worms mean less spice. Less spice shrinks prescience. Shrinking prescience shortens horizons and frays legitimacy. What matters here is the direction of causality. Political dreams of a green world on Arrakis are not just aesthetic or humanitarian debates. They are arguments about whether the Empire's calendar should survive. The Guild's reluctance to seize Arrakis outright, even when it might seem feasible, now reads differently. Their own sources told them any direct move would create a nexus of unpredictable outcomes. Part of that nexus is ecological complexity. The other part is political blowback. The first time a navigator signs a military order on the desert, neutrality is gone, and with it the trust that lets them be the Empire's courier. That trust is expensive to earn and instant to lose. The same goes for CHOAM's credibility. A dividend is a promise repeated often enough that people plan around it. Interrupt that rhythm, and the promise has to be rebuilt trade by trade. That is why CHOAM acts like a conservative institution, even when houses want daring ventures. Risk elsewhere is fine as long as the pipeline hums. Risk to the pipeline is a veto. We should also be clear about the limit of numbers. Spice is measured in weights and shares, but its real effect is measured in what people are willing to delay. When elites believe tomorrow will arrive, they build institutions that depend on patience, schools, long voyages, long research. When they think tomorrow might not arrive, those institutions thin out. People hoard, not just melange, but options. Society becomes liquid the way fear makes assets liquid. In the near term, this drives odd alliances. A house that detests a rival might call off a raid, because disrupting a carry-all lease would punish both of them more. A smuggler's ring might become an unofficial stabilizer by keeping a trickle of supply moving when official lanes falter. The important point is that morality does not change here, constraints do. The operating system rewards whoever can keep the schedule believable, which returns us to the throne. Even an emperor cannot flex away from dependency. He can threaten, but the guild can delay. He can decree, but CHOAM can stall a payout. He can demand, but a desert community can remove a dozen harvesters from service and watch the math roll uphill. Authority must root through these constraints, or it bleeds out as rhetoric. That is why victories that ignore logistics are really announcements of future defeats. Short-term squeezes are especially dangerous. The Harkonnens plan to squeeze Arrakis for 60 years, framed as fiscal necessity to repay transport debts, also seeded rebellion by raising the extraction pressure that makes operations sloppy and vulnerable. Cheapness in the desert is not an economizing choice. It is an invitation to sabotage. The next step depended on that earlier decision to treat a living ecology like a mine that could be bullied. There is a quieter, personal layer to this system. Spice, as memory and longevity, makes powerful people more attached to their plans and more anxious about disruption. That psychology increases their appetite for hoards and early warning. They hire more navigators. They build more stockpiles. Ironically, those same behaviors make the market jumpier and the politics more brittle. The tool that extends life shortens patience for risk. Against that brittleness, Leto's promise of diffuse power reads like a stress test. If hidden stockpiles surface across the universe, elites cannot control scarcity with one siege or one deal. The guild would face multiple suppliers, each with their own local veto. CHOAM would engage a wider, messier customer base. The Fremen would no longer be the only community able to set the tempo. Power would disperse into the fabric of communities that can live with unreliability. For now, though, the operating system remains centralized enough that a delay on Arrakis counts more than a decision in a palace. Spice ties ecology to economy, and then to legitimacy by way of time. Anyone seeking control must master scheduling, not just territory, and every lever they pull exerts back pressure through addiction, profit, and prescience. That is not a metaphor. It is the user manual for this empire, which is why understanding melange as more than a resource changes how the story reads. We stop asking who owns the spice and we start asking who can move it, who can pause it, who can predict it, and who can survive without it for a while. Those questions sort factions more cleanly than banners do. They also foreshadow what it would mean to break the monopoly on purpose. One last detail ties the system together. Spice does not forgive ignorance. A house can buy a shipment, but if it cannot read the desert's clock, it will pay twice, once in coin and again in consequences. In practice, knowledge of rhythms becomes its own currency, traded between CH, guild hall, and counting room. The next chapter of power begins where that currency changes hands. Power in the Imperium wears crowns and uniforms, but it actually moves along 3 channels. The Padishah Emperor projects force, the Landsraad aggregates aristocratic consent, and the Spacing Guild controls movement. Each piece can stall the others, which is why decisions arrive slower than orders. The structure looks like feudalism, yet it behaves like a cartel with mutual hostages. Start with the Emperor. He commands the Sardaukar, shock troops built on Seleucus Secundus's prison ecology. Their purpose is obvious: punish defiance and broadcast fear. But terror works only when roads are open and cargo moves. That dependency forces the Emperor to keep the guild friendly, which means paying in melange and predictability. Now move to the Landsraad, the Congress of Great Houses. It functions like a political market where votes, favors, and alliances are priced and repriced. Houses join to prevent unilateral imperial decrees from wrecking their fiefs. This helps explain why imperial policy rarely looks like a clean line. It has to be bent by 100 private conditions. Then there is the guild, the decisive bottleneck. Without prescient navigators, travel contracts, troop deployments, and even messages fall into risk and delay. The guild's veto is not a speech, it is a schedule. When they cannot see a safe path, lanes are closed, shipments rearranged, and a ruler's timeline quietly dies on the dock. That triangle should paralyze everything. It does not, because a 4th piece knits them together. CHOAM, the Combine Onit Ober Advancer Mercantiles. CHOAM is the Empire's profit architecture. It allocates contracts and dividends to the Emperor and houses, rewarding stability with cash and punishing rashness by drying up capital. This wiring turns peace into income and turns surprise into loss. The important point is how discipline happens. CHOAM does not jail a reckless duke. It starves his projects. Partners stop co-investing, credit tightens, and middlemen demand guarantees. That detail reveals why coups often fail to change much. Even after a head rolls, the enterprise still needs ships, contracts, and insurance, all priced by people who dislike surprises. We see this logic spelled out in a cynical aside from Children of Dune. Corrino restorers say out loud what most houses only imply. Landsraad and CHOAM will go where the profit goes. The confession matters. It tells us legitimacy is not only moral, it is financial. If a pretender can keep dividends steady, old enemies remember shared interests faster than old insults. But there is a catch in that same scene. The speaker immediately asks, "What of the Fremen?" and reaches for religion as a solvent, will drown them in their Muad'Dib's religion. The impulse is revealing. When contracts cannot bend in ecology, factions try to rewrite belief. That move admits the limits of formal institutions, and shows why non-estate actors carry vetoes no edict can erase. Consider the guild's preferred veto method: helplessness. In Dune, Irulan insists the guild would never let commerce collapse. Chani answers with the mechanic behind neutrality. Who could blame the guild? They'd be helpless, demonstrably so. This is the guild's shield. By declaring all futures unsafe, they reframe a choice as a law of nature, and they do it with timetables rather than proclamations. There is a deeper reason for that passivity. Some Bene Gesserit texts note the guild saw a nexus, a point where small changes on Arrakis could spiral into catastrophe. They understood that trying to seize the spice source would create the very crisis they feared. That helps explain the guild's slow rolling, of imperial pressure. Delay was not only profit, it was survival. The Landsraad's slow pace works the same way. Aristocrats spread risk by forcing votes, committees, and bargaining periods. From the outside, it looks like paralysis. In practice, it is a safety valve. The machinery absorbs anger with process, so legions do not need to absorb it with blood. CHOAM is tuned to that tempo. Because dividends depend on broad cooperation, the board resists abrupt changes that might spook the guild or provoke sanctions. A risky policy is punished through prices before it is punished through force. That preemptive pricing pulls decision-makers back toward the middle, even when they crave a dramatic move. The unintended effect is that the Emperor becomes a coordinator more than a commander. Sardaukar threats still matter, but they sit inside a web of delivery schedules, share agreements, and aristocratic votes. What matters here is not the crest on the letterhead, but who can keep hundreds of moving parts from tripping each other. Authority becomes logistics management. This helps explain why the Atreides style reads as soft power rather than softness. They try to lower the transaction costs of ruling, those constant fees of mistrust that clog the system. Training generalists and mentats, they make choices legible across domains. When the army understands the budget and the merchants understand the plan, fewer intermediaries need bribes to stay patient. Contrast that with Sardaukar terror. Terror is fast and visible, but it is expensive to maintain and hard to scale without backlash. Fear-driven compliance requires constant demonstrations, which push the guild and CHOAM to price routes higher and shorten credit. That penalty shows up as strategic brittleness. The first supply disruption then cascades instead of dampening. Atreides' legitimacy tilts that ledger. On Caladan and later among Fremen, they invest in trust and reciprocal obligation. That reduces inspection costs, lowers security overhead, and gives CHOAM fewer reasons to hedge. The result is not utopia, it is resilience. More of the system wants them to succeed, because success looks cheaper and more predictable. The Bene Gesserit expose another texture of non-estate control. In a tense exchange with Thufirhawat, Jessica reveals the fist within the glove. She can compel, yet she refuses to be the Duke's bludgeon. The logic is institutional. Overusing compulsion would make a weakling of the ruler, and sabotage the long game of breeding, education, and influence. Restraint preserves optionality. That restraint doubles as insurance for the whole system. If the sisterhood conquered directly, the guild might retaliate by tightening roots, and the Landsraad would unite against a visible usurper. By shaping, not seizing, they anchor the arrangement that keeps their schools and clients safe. Influence spreads through invisible contracts. Fremen ecologies create a third constraint the law cannot touch. Harvesters obey sand and worm rhythms, not decrees. Even the guild's charts must defer to a storm no navigator can bargain with. Every time rulers forget this, the desert restores memory by breaking machines. Ecology sets the cadence, and institutions learn to synchronize to avoid breakage. When crisis arrives, the system's first move is to buy time. The guild announces routing complications. CHOAM calls an extraordinary session to review market conditions. The Landsraad opens a debate that absorbs days. The Emperor sends inspectors rather than regiments. Each delay is sold as prudence, but the deeper reason is clear. Speed multiplies risk in a cartelized order. We can see that math in the way assassinations land. Kill a duke and the household changes hands, but the contracts remain. Caravans still need escorts, banks still need repayments, and the guild still demands melange. The system reprices the new risk and continues. What mattered was never merely the name at the top. It was whether flows stayed within tolerances. This is why conspirators often overestimate the value of a throne. A coup can force recognition, but it cannot force liquidity. Without CHOAM dividends and guild access, a fresh regime bleeds cash before it bleeds enemies. That pattern turns many victories into slow defeats hidden behind celebratory banners. In Children of Dune, Leto II states the core principle with blunt clarity. Survival requires interlocking communities, interdependence, and working together in the common design, that is the system. He intends to break the old monopoly, to make this real, building a network where no single actor can seize the choke point again. He is planning for a world where coordination replaces dominance. That future vision throws the present into sharper relief. The Emperor, Landsraad, Guild, and CHOAM believe they are stabilizing power. In truth, they are metering conflict. They keep violence and greed within the bandwidth the system can handle. The method is rarely noble, but it prevents the kind of cascade that turns planets into warnings. The Guild's fear of a prescient nexus is a technical way of saying the same thing. A nexus is where feedback amplifies past the point of control. By refusing to act when they see one forming, the Guild acts like a circuit breaker. Their passivity adds slack to the schedule, draining energy from an emerging spiral. The Landsraad's quorum rules play a similar role. By design, large houses must listen to smaller ones enough to pass motions. That slows outcomes and spreads responsibility, which lowers retaliatory incentives. Nobody feels completely cornered, so fewer actors reach for annihilating options. The important point is not fairness, but survivability. CHOAM coordinates the profit motive to the same end. Its boards prefer a steady 10% to a risky 30% with revolt attached. That preference teaches houses to pursue gains that do not ignite coalitions against them. The result is a culture where threats are hinted, not executed, and where success looks like continued dividends, not banners over palaces. Yet none of this works without legitimacy, the invisible oil in the gears. The Atreides approach shows why. When subjects believe decisions are within the realm of reason, they grant rulers the benefit of the doubt. That reduces the need for demonstrations of force and frees capacity for adaptation. Legitimacy, therefore, lowers volatility as effectively as any treaty. Here is where Mentag generalist thinking becomes more than a style. Generalists knit military, economic, and cultural maps into one plan. They prevent specialists from optimizing one metric at the expense of the whole. In a cartelized feudal system, that integration keeps choices aligned with the capacities of the network. It maintains legibility across the actors who must execute. Specialists, on the other hand, often drive chaos without noticing. A brilliant general who ignores supply, or a financier who ignores pride, triggers hidden constraints. The system resists by pushing back through schedules, prices, and votes. What feels like sabotage is simply the network protecting itself from a narrow conception of victory. Because these institutions meter conflict, signals matter as much as actions. A Sardokara exercise near a rival's fief is a negotiation opening. A CHOAM rumor about dividend adjustments is a soft veto. A guild surcharge on a particular corridor is a message about acceptable ambitions. Reading those signals is half of ruling. Consider the moment when a faction threatens to starve the Guild of Spice. On paper, it looks like leverage. In practice, as Chani pointed out, communication would break down. Who could be blamed? The Guild can claim helplessness and shift blame onto physics and addiction. That move protects them while punishing the would-be extortionist with universal anger. Even within families, this structure shapes choices. In the Corrino exchange, eagerness to reclaim the throne runs into three hard checks: Fremen religion, Landsraad arithmetic, and CHOAM profit. Each check forces a change of tactic. That friction teaches why patient, layered strategies beat overt power plays in this universe. Hence the preference for soft tools with hard edges. The Bene Gesserit seed myths rather than decree conversions. The Atreides build competence rather than buy compliance. The Guild adjusts rates instead of declaring embargoes. These are the instruments of a system that prefers nudges to shocks, because shocks turn small mistakes into regime-level crises. Of course, the meter can jam. When a pattern of slow rolling and profit smoothing prevents necessary adaptation, pressure accumulates unseen. Leto II sees that danger. His talk of Kralizek, universal war, warns that the old balance cannot handle the ecologies and populations it pretends to govern. The solution he offers is paradoxical: break concentration to preserve order. He points to deep treasures and hidden stockpiles, not as hoards to seize, but as seeds for a dispersion. As the spice monopoly fades, new powers will appear. That prediction reframes the cartel not as evil, but as temporary scaffolding. The interlocking communities he imagines will carry redundancy, making the empire resilient without a central choke point. Until that shift, though, the triad plus CHOAM still governs behavior. Rulers think in margins: how much force before the guild punishes timing, how much profit before the Landsraad flips, how much delay before Sardaukar must move. The invisible math shapes visible events. The practical lesson is plain. In this world, power is the ability to keep complex schedules predictable for strangers. The Emperor keeps fleets ready. The Landsraad keeps debates contained. The Guild keeps routes coherent. CHOAM keeps money patient. Anyone who makes those jobs easier rises. Anyone who complicates them pays. That is why the Atreides look stronger than their troop counts. They replaced arbitrary rule with interpretable plans, which lowered everyone's insurance premiums. CHOAM paid steadier dividends. The Guild faced fewer emergency reroutes. The Landsraad saw fewer reasons to panic. That trust compounded faster than interest, and it is why Sardaukar fear lost its edge over time. Each display had to escalate to match familiar terror, which raised costs and sharpened coordination among targets. The cartel learned to sidestep the blade by sharing risk and information. Fear, once metabolized, becomes just another budget line item. All of this sits under one big idea. The Imperium's institutions do not end conflict. They meter it so the system can survive shocks. The throttle is shared among the Emperor, the Landsraad, the Guild, and CHOAM, with non-estate actors and ecologies applying their own brakes. Power is exercised by adjusting those meters, not by flooring the engine. The next shift will come when someone changes the meters themselves. Leto II tends to do exactly that by altering scarcity, belief, and mobility. But in the world we are charting now, survival belongs to those who understand the cartel's timing, speak the language of dividends and delays, and can make their necessity obvious to their rivals. Because in a system like this, being necessary is the safest kind of strength. It turns enemies into stakeholders and transforms demands into maintenance. That detail will matter when the spice clock falters, and every actor must decide whether to cling to a symbol or to keep the schedules alive. Belief in Dune is not set dressing. It functions like infrastructure, a routing system for loyalty and risk that sits beside spice logistics and trade schedules. That is why power changes hands in sermons as often as in battles, and it is why even an emperor cannot ignore a voice that recalibrates what people think is morally possible. The Bene Gesserit built the first major layer of this infrastructure with the mission area protected. This was their field office for belief, a centuries-long program that planted survival myths on distant worlds. The point was insurance. If a sister had to flee or embed, she could invoke a local prophecy key to her skills, and communities would accept her as a foretold guide rather than a stranger. Paul and Jessica knew this. Fleeing into the desert, they counted on it. Paul's quiet line about the mission area having bought us a bolt hole was not bravado. It was systems knowledge. The Fremen carried preloaded stories about a mother and son, signs to watch for, and duties to fulfill. In practice, this meant a stranger could be recognized not by birth, but by script alignment. That is why the myths were designed like plug-and-play modules. Each one contained a set of passwords, behaviors, and tests a sister could trigger. This worked because it compressed trust acquisition into ritual. Once a community admitted the possibility that a figure might be the one, They had procedures that governed what came next. Trials, signs, leadership privileges, and, crucially, obligations. On Arrakis, those scripts meant something unusual. Fremen expectations were already pointed toward a savior, but their culture rewarded proof through action. Paul arrived with Bene Gesserit signifiers, military training, and an inherited Atreides charisma built on fairness and audacity. When that package fit the prophecy socket, belief did what belief does in tight communities. It aligned attention, accelerated decisions, and multiplied the force of limited resources. The price of that acceleration was choice compression. A messianic frame simplifies branching paths into a single righteous road. What mattered here was not whether Paul intended a holy war, but that people now understood sacrifice through a sacred lens. Losses moved from personal trade-offs to covenant fulfillment. The important point is that this reframing altered how much risk followers would accept and how quickly leaders could mobilize them. Frank Herbert uses a simple parable to explain the danger at the start of such movements. The Fremen tell of a wolf and a dog, both with teeth, both circling the flock. Both. At the beginning, the people cannot tell which one they have chosen, protector or predator, because early leadership often looks like both. This helps explain why charisma joined to prophecy feels benevolent while it consolidates uncheckable power. Alia's regency tried to live off that ambiguity. The regime retained Muad'Dib's symbols and timed public rituals to keep the aura intact. Elsewhere, Corrino conspirators discussed weaponizing the same faith against the Fremen, promising to drown them in Muad'Dib's religion. The scheme sounds decisive, but a line in that same exchange points to the ceiling. Easier said than done. Prophecy can be turned on, but it can also turn on you. Religion in Dune spreads coordination at low cost because it rides on shared stories and habits. It reduces transaction friction the way currency or calendars do, but it also installs moral vetoes. Once an oath is bound to a sacred narrative, leaders must satisfy both the need to govern and the need to perform the myth. Ignore the vetoes and you do not just face opposition. You lose the definition of legitimacy inside your own base. The jihad demonstrates belief's velocity effect. Logistics still ruled the theater. Ships had to refuel. Armies needed water and rations. Supply lines could be ambushed. Yet belief altered the throughput of pain the movement could bear. Deaths were processed as martyrdom, and defeats became tests of faith. That detail reveals why the same military capacity under a secular banner would have stalled sooner. Belief increased the rate at which people accepted losses and maintained cohesion. This is where Herbert makes the Bene Gesserit both brilliant and culpable. They built myths to keep human populations maneuverable under sisterly influence. The preacher later calls it out with surgical clarity, how they create the myths by which men sleep. He names the anesthesia and the addiction at once, and people are soothed into trusting the shape of the story, then driven by that story into actions they might not have taken if they had kept a wider frame. The preacher's function in Children of Dune is not to win back a throne. His function is to reassert a higher constraint on rulers who have mistaken sanctity for license. He warns that Paul became a saint without a god, which is Herbert's way of saying the symbol had swallowed the substance. What mattered here was the boundary he tried to redraw. No one stands above the moral order, not even the Messiah who animated it. Gurney Halleck's unease around the preacher helps us see the mechanism. Gurney feels tested by words rather than swords, because myths rewire obedience pathways. The Atreides mystique pulled on old loyalties that had once been anchored in pragmatic justice. Now those same cues could be triggered by robes and phrases. The preacher attacked that trigger set, forcing listeners to separate voice from vestment and behavior from beatified memory. Herbert lets Ghanima name the deeper danger with a bitter, almost humorous image. She talks about people turning into man snails, carrying the heavy shell of a ruler's house as though it were their own body. The point is dependency. When a society fuses its identity to a personified power, it trades the lightness of self-correction for the comfort of a protective carapace. Breaking that bond later requires tearing flesh from shell. This helps explain why cures in Dune feel like pain. Removing deified rule means stripping away the very structure that made decisions simple and belonging effortless. In practice, that pain is a cost the system must pay to recover optionality. Leto II will force this payment on a civilizational scale. He does not erase belief. He subjects it to a longer, harsher discipline, so communities learn to stand without imperial crutches. Notice how even Paul, with all his leverage, acknowledges belief's constraints around spice. In a private debate, Chani and Irulan sketch the limits of simple denial. Cutting off melange would break prescient navigation, collapse communication, and kill innocence without clear blame assignment. The important point is that moral narratives shape acceptable tactics. Even a triumphant Messiah had to choose solutions that his own story could carry without shattering. This brings us back to the Missionaria Protectiva as a tool with a catch. It gave the Bene Gesserit a script library and embedded audiences. But it also democratized manipulation. Once those myths existed, others could trigger them, including an Atreides boy the Sisterhood had not planned to control. That detail tells us something important about system design. A protocol that lowers activation costs lowers barriers for adversaries as well. Under Alia, theocracy hardened into a bureaucracy of veneration. Festivals, reliquaries, and public displays kept the machine humming, but the machine lived on credit extended by a miracle story. The preacher's counter-sermons functioned like a bank run on that credit. They asked depositors of faith to question the solvency of the narrative. That pressure did not topple the government by itself. It narrowed the paths available to those who wished to keep power while claiming holiness. Herbert ties this to ecology and time again through Leto's later explanation of interlocking communities, interdependence, working together in the common design. He is describing a social metabolism that no single priestkin can control. Belief still coordinates, but it coordinates laterally rather than only vertically. This helps explain why the Golden Path emphasizes distributed resilience. A belief that binds neighbors into self-correcting units is harder to kidnap from the center. There's one more layer. Religion establishes not just norms, but pacing. Holy days, fasts, and pilgrimage seasons regulate when mass attention peaks. On Arrakis, the desert already imposed a hard calendar of wind and worm. The messianic overlay synced mobilization to sacred time. That synchronization helped fleets launch and treaties be signed on cue. It also locked rulers into windows where defiance would look like sacrilege, further constraining strategic timing. So belief behaves like a protocol that routes consent, distributes attention, and meters outrage. Leaders who understand this can move faster with fewer orders because the story itself carries momentum. But they inherit the story's guardrails. The Corrino dream of drowning the Fremen in Muad'Dib's religion recognized the power of the channel while misreading its directionality. You cannot reverse a river by pouring more water. You must change the gradient. The preacher's gift to the system is skepticism that does not erase faith, but insists on accountability within it. He undermines the notion that a theocracy is destiny, and restores the idea that rulers answer to something higher than their own myth. That move does not end the game. It restores friction where speed had erased caution. In Dune, that friction is not failure. It is a safety feature that keeps belief from becoming a single, obliterating vector. Seen this way, messianic alignment was both multiplier and trap for the Atreides. It made impossible mobilizations possible, while narrowing their imaginable futures. The missionaria's cleverness bought survival, and then demanded repayment with interest. The jihad converted scarcity into moral fuel, and the preacher, inconvenient and relentless, tried to renegotiate the price by reintroducing limits. We will soon watch Leto II move from critique to engineering. He will not discard religion any more than he will discard spice. He will redesign the gradient, spreading belief across interdependent communities, timing it to new rhythms, and starving the center of the monopoly it craves. In other words, he will treat belief as infrastructure, and he will rebuild it for resilience rather than capture. That redesign begins with breaking the old roots. Time is the quiet instrument every major faction reaches for when direct control fails. The Bene Gesserit choose slow compounding over conquest, harvesting influence from breeding plans and careful social planting. The Bene Tleilax experiment their way through bottlenecks, using golas and face dancers to survive whoever sits the throne. And then Leto II arrives and makes time itself the battlefield, rewriting incentives across centuries. What matters here is the difference between using time to accumulate leverage and using time to alter the rules of accumulation. The first builds a hand to play later. The second changes the game other players can even recognize. The Bene Gesserit's breeding program is a study in optionality. They do not only chase a superhuman, the Kwisatz Haderach, so much as they stock a gene bank of traits, temperaments, and latent capabilities they can recombine. This works because uncertainty favors those with many paths, not those with one. Their Missionaria Protectiva spreads portable myths and rituals that can be activated when needed, turning belief into an instant trust scaffold. In practice, this is power without banners. It allows them to bend events by making communities pre-accept the shape of a savior, a mother, or a warning. That detail reveals why they avoid seizing thrones outright. Thrones concentrate risk. They also paint a target that other institutions, CHOAM's merchants, the guild navigators, great houses, can coordinate against. Instead, the sisterhood inserts teachers, midwives, and confidantes into dynasties and frontier cultures. The effect is less dramatic, but more resilient. Each insertion changes how choices get made at the family and village level, which is where loyalties harden. Over decades, that small tilt compounds into dynastic predispositions, succession biases, and cultural reflexes that are hard to uproot with a coup. The Bene Tleilax take a different long horizon. Their tools, golas grown in axolotl tanks, face dancers who mimic identity, and engineered taboos, give them an adaptive hedge against monopolies of truth and resource. A gola repeats a lost skill set. A face dancer penetrates an institution without siege. This helps explain why they seldom seek open rule. They profit most when others mistake continuity for safety. If an emperor falls, their product line survives the fault line. If a religion calcifies, a face dancer can impersonate its enforcers long enough to reshape its practice. Controlled heresy is a strategy. Keep doctrines fluid enough to pivot yet stable enough to sell. Golas become even more telling under Leto II. He keeps resurrecting Duncan, Idaho, cycle after cycle, and the choice is not sentimental. Duncan serves as a calibration tool, an anchor for human responses inside a long-planned variance. Memory in Golas can revive under shock, which turns each Duncan into a living archive with a delayed fuse. Leto uses that continuity to measure drift in his own system. When a Duncan recoils at enforced tranquility, it is a data point on what peace is doing to human nerve. The important point is not just that memory returns, but that institutional learning survives resets. We hear Leto describe the bargain plainly. Throughout the Empire, Leto's peace, he says, then answers the complaint. My peace is actually enforced tranquility. Humans have a long history of reacting against tranquility. He creates the fish speakers, a female army whose bond to him is part worship, part discipline. This worked because a visible hierarchy reduces the transaction costs of rule in a sprawling empire. It also channeled male aggression away from organized coup-making. But the hierarchy doubles as a sieve. It prevents the easy outbreak of war while preserving the human capacity to chafe, to test, to remember edges. That tension points to Leto's deeper move. Asked if he is only playing the old power game, he answers, a very old one, but with new rules. He warns that monolithic centralized power is a dangerous and volatile instrument, and he does not trust the hands that came before him. The continuity here matters. He seizes central power to end the age that worships it. Many regimes promise present rule for future freedom. Leto builds that future freedom into the plumbing, by rebalancing scarcity, movement, learning, and belief, until the throne becomes an obstacle, not a prize. We hear that design language earlier in Children of Dune, where Leto describes survival as a pattern of interlocking communities, interdependence, working together in the common design, which is the system. That is not a poetic slogan. It is systems engineering. Interlocking communities distribute failure and push knowledge to move laterally, not just vertically. Then he delivers the hard forecast. Who will survive Kralizek? I promise you, Kralizek will come. Kralizek is the upheaval, the storm of storms. Leto treats it as a certainty to prepare for, not something to prevent. This is where time becomes a weapon. He builds a species-wide shock absorber. Spice is where he tests the absorber. He foretells a time when the last worm dies and the last melange is harvested. After that come hidden stockpiles that let new powers rise as the spice monopoly fades. On the surface, this looks like simple scarcity management. In practice, it is a controlled demolition of a single point of failure economy. A monopoly eases coordination, but makes the system brittle. By rationing melange for centuries, hoarding caches, and staging a famine window, Leto trains the empire to operate without the old supply chain. That detail would shape the next decisions. Once spice no longer guarantees mobility and foresight, other competencies start to matter. That is why ecological transformation sits at the core of his plan. He tunes Arrakis's water, the sand trout, and the worm cycles to decide when spice can form and who may reach it. Under his rule, melange moves only through him, an apparent perfect choke point. Yet the aim is paradoxical. He wants everyone to learn not to depend on any choke point at all. After his death, the famine times take hold. Then comes the scattering, a spread of people, tools, and experiments beyond the old map. Later Bene Gesserit records put it plainly. Millennia of enforced peace followed by the famine times and the scattering. He did not destroy the Bene Tlilax or the Bene Gesserit. He kept adversaries intact because competition preserves memory. Peace itself becomes a training field. Humans have a long history of reacting against tranquility, Leto says, and he builds feedback for that reaction. Fish speakers are not just soldiers. They are an identification protocol in a world without constant war. They keep quarrels from resetting the map, while other forms of variation, technological tinkering, cultural divergence, smuggling of ideas, continue. This helps explain why the Sisterhood and the Tlilaxu both survive him. He circumscribes conflict, but he does not flatten difference. The interlocking pattern insists that communities learn to work alongside rivals. They cannot eliminate, because elimination would kill the learning loop. Belief is routed the same way. Leto allows godhood to hang over daily life, but he weaponizes the reaction against it. The awe fixes a common horizon, a single figure no faction can capture. Then he invests in the horizontal. Regional cults, professional cadres, and local lineages retain their own rituals and narratives. What mattered here was the gradient. Top-down faith coordinates the macro, while bottom-up practices maintain experimentation. At scale, this resists takeover. A would-be theocrat can excite a district, but conversion does not flip the empire, because the interlocks run through habit, not just proclamation. The Idaho Gholas sit at the intersection of these feedbacks. Each Duncan returns with human-scale judgment and a memory fuse that may or may not light. Leto uses him to test whether his new rules still produce honest pushback. A Gola who learns to say no is a sign that the system can regenerate dissent within peace. A Gola who bends too easily warns of stagnation. This is institutional learning disguised as personal drama. The memory bridge across deaths lets a way of thinking persist longer than any office or regiment. It is the closest the Empire has to a continuous ethics committee that remembers when and why it refused. Contrast this with the way most rulers use time. They extend dynasties, entrench borders, or soak enemies in attrition, expecting that patience alone will produce advantage. The Bene Gesserit and the Tleilaxu do something smarter. They treat time as variation, not just duration. They fill it with options. Leto advances it again. He treats time as a designer's toolkit, installing constraints and buffers so that, when the crisis Kralitzek arrives, the species roots around damage. The important point is not that he sees farther. It is that he commits to shaping the path between now and the visible future, even when the path makes him the villain who must be removed. You can hear that fatalism in his exchanges with Duncan. Leto taunts, "Would you like me to find another Baron Harkonnen to assume power over the Empire?" Then he admits, "I'm not sure about my own hands, but I am sure about the hands of those who went before me." He does not erase the old factions. He forces them to coexist through famine, scattering, and the end of easy spice. In other words, he moves the floor, not the furniture. The floor is scarcity, the rules of movement, and the way belief travels. When those change, the furniture, the emperor's name, the council titles, the regimental banners, can never mean the same thing again. This is the system-level lesson. Long plans that design feedbacks beat short plans that see symbols. The Bene Gesserit's breeding lattice, the Tleilaxu's Gola economy, and Leto's Golden Path all use time to store power. But only the last uses time to disperse it on purpose. But by staging scarcity, enforcing a peace that invites reaction, and preserving adversaries he could have crushed, Leto produces interlocking communities able to survive Kralitzek. The next winners will not be those who capture a throne. They will be those whose communities can learn with neighbors they cannot dominate, under constraints they did not choose. That is the resilience his weaponized time is trying to teach. Herbert gives us a simple operating rule. We live in an impermanent universe, but our institutions crave permanence. He treats a society as an organism driven by old reflexes, and those reflexes push back whenever leaders try to expose change as the baseline. That resistance is not abstract. It shows up as fear, anger, and despair when promised routines are threatened. This helps explain why power in Dune is constantly slipping. The system punishes anyone who pretends the sea is still while the tide is moving. The same passage tells us why prescience is embraced even when it predicts ruin. A voice promising an absolute or something that feels permanent can be greeted with relief. Prescience lowers uncertainty, and humans use it as a psychological technology against doubt. But it has a cost. Once a society outsources uncertainty to an oracle, it accepts a narrower corridor of future choices, and every decision starts hugging the walls of that corridor. That helps clarify Paul's trap. As Muad'Dib, he did not just win battles. He offered a frame that reduced chaos. The movement could say, events are contained in a vision. Even warnings took on the flavor of certainty. The paradox is that certainty attracts loyalty while quietly compressing agency. When reality diverges, the response is not adaptation, but condemnation and ritual. That is how prescience can win legitimacy while laying the groundwork for fragility. Enter the preacher, walking back into the imperial orbit under a bonded guild agreement. He makes an argument the novels keep repeating. The planet remembers. People carry layered histories in their habits, and the land itself resists fantasy. The phrase, planet's memory, is a way to say that decisions are judged against inherited meanings. try to jump too far from those meanings, and the audience does not just disagree. They revolt, because the move feels like betrayal rather than policy. This is why some acts are credible, and others are not, regardless of force. Alia draped herself in Atreides symbols, but her regime's behavior broke the lived memory of Fremen reciprocity and discipline. The preacher, drawing from that memory, reintroduced friction and doubt. He slowed her theocracy by reminding people of how the old compacts worked. What mattered here was not rhetoric alone, but alignment with the stored expectations people trusted to survive the desert. The landscape carried its own form of inertia. When Arrakis began to green, that was more than scenery. Water tables rose, habitats shifted, and the sandworm life cycle weakened. Worms produce the spice, and spice routes everything from interstellar travel to minor trade margins. A small ecological change pushes a large economic lever. The greening program looked like prosperity, but it quietly dismantled the foundation contract, that Arrakis would always be a reliable fountain of melange. This is why logistical accounting shows up like a character in the story. With fewer worms, spice flow thins, prices rise, and schedules stretch. Cartels revalue risk and ration supply. Leto II managed this deliberately, but ecology set the tempo. Leaders can declare policy on Tuesday. The water table replies on its own time. The important point is not just that power depends on spice, but that the mechanisms producing spice resist rapid reversal once they begin to change. Paul once framed it this way in A Tent on the Run. The place to hit them is in the spice. He was naming a logic. On Caladan, sea power and air power moved the economy. On Arrakis, supply chains ride sand and depend on a single biochemical cycle. Control the cycle, you control the map of possible actions. That detail reveals why symbolic power without logistical leverage keeps collapsing in Dune. Thrones can order, but deserts decide what moves. Now pair that with the preacher telling Farad'n he is summoned by a power greater than thine, while Tyachonic invokes a bonded guild agreement. In that little exchange, we see a prince confronted by institutions that can overrule his will without firing a shot. The guild's addiction to spice binds them to Arrakis, and their contracts bind clients to the guild. A throne cannot cancel the physics of dependence. It must negotiate with it, or find itself bypassed. Cartels survive because they are built to price shocks, not to defeat them. When violence rises, they do not preach about destiny. They rewrite premiums, widen spreads, and rebalance portfolios of routes and clients. Smugglers embedded in the same web shift risk to smaller vessels and varied caches. Zealotry, by contrast, burns supply lines to light the message. It wins the day and loses the quarter. This helps explain why slow economic bodies outlast charismatic regimes. Maintenance is a politics. Consider maintenance in cultural time. Slow institutions carry standards, audit trails, and habits of deferral. They look inertial and boring. That boredom is a feature. It absorbs noise precisely when charismatic command is most tempted to overshoot. In Dune, that looks like the way CHOAM keeps doing accounting in the shadow of prophets, or how Fremen clans keep reciting water discipline under banners that promise paradise. Repeated actions keep communities from liquefying under pressure. Surveillance creates its own failure mode when trust is thin. Alia called it like fighting in the dark, even though she held power and information. The problem was not data scarcity. It was interpretive noise. Rival organs did not trust each other, and each report triggered suspicion loops. More inputs without common belief about verification only escalate decision churn. In practice, you make slower, worse choices because every signal has to be checked against the people sending it. Prescience amplifies that paradox from a different angle. It pretends to remove noise, but often removes the exploratory behavior that reduces surprise. Once a leader declares a path is seen, lieutenants stop experimenting and start filtering anomalies out. The organization becomes skilled at denial. That is why Paul's certainty produced obedience while starving policy of options. Leto II took the hint in reverse. Use vision not to fix outcomes, but to enforce conditions where exploration must return. So he rationed spice and extended a long peace that frustrated everyone. He forced interlocking communities to depend on one another, then weakened the monopoly that allowed any single faction to guarantee its comfort. Scarcity in his design was not punishment. It was a break and a teacher. When he died and the last worms disappeared for a time, the system did not just mourn. It reconfigured under pressure. The scattering was not a glitch. It was a release valve baked into the plan. Planetary memory returned in that reconfiguration. Former Fremen turned imperial citizens still knew sandwalks and sight-law, but they repurposed them in ports and monasteries and trading posts. Water discipline translated into storage discipline for stories, genomes, and seeds. Governance that ignored those translations failed. Governance that recognized them found legitimacy. That detail tells us something important. Continuity survives when leaders keep the shape of memory while changing its content. Inertia, then, is not only an enemy. It is also the friction that prevents cascades. CHOAM's bureaucracy and the CHOAM ritual look different, but both dampen volatility. They also slow useful reform. That is the bargain. Powerful systems buy reliability with drag. Leaders who misread this call the drag sabotage and try to purge it. Leaders who work with it propose reforms as amendments to memory, not abolitions. That is how you bend a system without asking it to break. Designing for impermanence means getting comfortable with loss and versioning. It favors redundancy over neatness, slack over tight tolerances, and decentralization over monopolies. Leto's rationing, the dispersal of stockpiles, the encouragement of parallel communities with different failure modes. Those were not accidents. They were moves to keep anyone shocked from holding everything hostage. The important point is that durability in Dune is engineered as a distribution problem, not a command problem. Look at what actually endures across the saga. It is not crowns. It is habits, roots, and the accounting of risk. It is the mental model that spice scarcity will return, that water cannot be wasted, that a prophecy might be a tool, not a fate. That even the preacher's interruptions worked this way. He did not overthrow Alia with a battle. He reweighted the credibility of memories people already carried, making her actions land harder against their own standards. This helps explain the outcomes that look like fate from a distance. The jihad burned bright and fast, then forced the empire to discover the carrying capacity of its own logistics. The famine times punished complacency about ecological change. Kralitzek, the Great Conflict, was as much about organizational survival as battlefield heroics. In each case, the winners were those who preserved learning capacity while letting symbols go. Those who clutched the symbols usually ran out of fuel first. The paradox is gentle but firm. To keep something lasting, design it for change. A durable ruler does not ask how to freeze an alignment. They ask, when it decays, where should the energy go? Channel that decay into lateral ties, predictable rations, and cultural memory that can be remixed. Do that, and power stops being a grip. It becomes rails that still hold shape when the train changes. This is why a bonded contract can humble a prince, and a poem about gods obliterating can feel like a manual. The poem reminds us that cures bring pain because they replace one system with another, and systems resist that intrusion. The contract shows that even a throne must pass through someone else's gate. Together, they explain why control in Dune looks strong right up until it meets a force with longer roots or more branches. So, what survives? Not dominion, but design. Not the absolute of a seen future, but a structure that invites many futures without falling apart. The preacher's scolding, the guild's invoices, the sandworm's hunger, and the CHOAM's ledger all converge on that lesson. Build for change, and change will not gut you. Deny change, and your own followers will help it along, because they must. In the final model, that is the only permanence worth trusting. Here is the working model that pulls Dune's scattered tensions into one map. Resources set the tempo of what is possible day to day. Beliefs set the speed of coordination, making people move together or drift apart. Institutions meter conflict, converting raw rivalry into rules, prices, and routinized pressure. Long-time plans reshape the baseline itself, changing what every other part means. Start with tempo. Spice is not only a drug or a currency, it is the metronome for travel, finance, and cognition. Whoever controls its flow can speed up or slow down everything that depends on it, from guild routes to elite training. Leto promised a time when the last worm would die, and hidden stockpiles would suddenly matter, and he tied that shock to new powers appearing. That was a tempo change by design, forcing the system to reset its beat. Belief is a speed multiplier because it lowers the cost of coordination. The Fremen faith system, seeded in part by the Bene Gesserit's Missionaria Protectiva, let Paul command mass risk-taking at extraordinary velocity. Ghanima later showed another face of this power when she and Farad'n built a compact without voice, appealing to the guts rather than to procedure. That detail reveals how legitimacy can be scripted, not merely decreed. Institutions meter conflict by placing repeatable channels between adversaries. The Landsraad, the Great Houses, the Spacing Guild, and the CHOAM combine create routines where threat is priced and concession is scheduled. In practice, these bodies do not end rivalry. They tame it into predictable patterns that allow commerce and survival between crises. Leto's long piece used the same logic, but with rationed spice as the master dial. Time plans are the baseline editors. The Bene Gesserit breeding program, the Bene Tlilax Gola experiments, and the prophetic gambits all change the initial conditions for later choices. But prescience inside Herbert's world is limited, not omniscient. Leto says, universal prescience is an empty myth, and only strong local currents can be seen. That boundary explains why long-range planners design slack and redundancy, rather than betting on perfect foresight. The Golden Path is exactly that, a plan to reshape the baseline, then step away. With the parts in view, watch the key feedbacks. Scarcity raises veto power, because the actor who can halt a flow commands negotiations without firing a shot. Legitimacy lowers policing costs, because people enforce the order on themselves when the story fits their memory. Ecological change rewrites contracts, as when Arrakis's greening weakened the sandworm cycle and forced everyone to live with thinner spice. Prescience narrows optionality, comforting leaders with certainty while stripping away experiments that might reveal better futures. Now apply the model to spice embargoes. When the guild or a ruler constricts spice, tempo drops for every spice-dependent function, and veto power rises for the embargoing node. As scarcity bites, institutions reprice risk, and houses look for substitutes or side deals, opening leverage for anyone with a stockpile. Leto's remark about hidden caches, making their mark, captures the bargaining pivot such reserves create. Outcomes in these standoffs come from scarcity geometry, not from individual boldness. Consider messianic mobilization. Paul's ascent among the Fremen shows belief accelerating coordination beyond any bureaucratic capacity. The script had been planted ahead of time, so recognition came cheaply, and enforcement rode on devotion, not surveillance. But prescience pushed Paul into a narrow path, where refusing the jihad seemed worse than accepting it, and every delay prolonged the present, as Bijaz warned. The important point is not just that belief scaled power, but that foresight locked it, reducing true choice. Turn to the Golden Path. Leto rationed spice to make communities interdependent, then enforced a peace that trained enemies to live inside shared systems. He predicted Kralizek, promised to shatter the empire, and tied the last worm's death to the birth of distributed power. In practice, he broke the monopoly so no single faction could reassemble the old cartel of travel, cognition, and prophecy. What mattered here was the shift from commanding to designing, from victory to constraint architecture. From these cases emerged three practical leverage points. First, choke logistics when negotiation fails, because tempo pressure forces rebalancing faster than rhetoric. Second, widen belief scripts to reclaim freedom, since broader stories allow more lawful behavior without coercion. Third, diversify time horizons, keeping parallel bets alive so you do not get trapped in one predictive channel. Each move uses the system's own routines to bend outcomes with smaller, earlier pushes. Why then does no one rule alone? Because capturing any single node invites countervailing pressure from the others. Take the throne, you alert the guild, the Landsraad, and religious authorities, who will meter you with prices, vetoes, and narratives. Take the spice and innovators explore non-spice cognition or off-world shocks, undercutting your choke point. Take the cult and institutions fence you with treaties and audits, channeling zeal back into procedure. Prescience especially demands humility. Leto's analysis that only local currents can be seen means long plans must cope with unknowns rather than master them. That helps explain his grim ethical calculus. If I don't prevent it, is that not killing him? Because design sometimes requires allowing pain to preserve range for the species. Leaders who ignore this trade-off often win short and lose the baseline. In other words, certainty comforts rulers while quietly closing their exits. Ecology sits beneath everything like a slow constitution. When Arrakis shifted from desert to green, the worm cycle faltered, spice creation thinned, and every contract linked to melange had to be rewritten. Leto spoke of a secret place, below the sands, and of treasures that would spring up when the last worm died. Whether you read that as literal caches or structural slack, the message is the same. Ecological pivots reorder markets, myths, and meters at once. Legitimacy grows more from cultural memory than from symbols. Ganima's political offer to Farad'n signaled a new script, with no formal husband, perhaps something like love, and a recognition that each moment brings change. It was not theater. It was a low-cost way to turn rivals into partners under a new rule. This also explains why the voice was unnecessary in that scene. The social ledger tipped because the story fit the room's memory. Now, extract heuristics you can carry across the saga. Ask first, what sets tempo in this chapter, and who can slow or speed it? Then, which belief scripts are active, and do they narrow or widen lawful behavior? Next, where is conflict being metered, and who adjusts the meter? Finally, what long plans are editing the baseline, and what optionality are they adding or removing? Each question tries to see the operating system under the drama. Watch feedbacks as early warnings. Scarcity spikes signal coming veto power long before open conflict appears. Sudden claims to sacred stories often reveal coordination campaigns, not only piety. Ecological signals, reign where dunes once stood, mean the fine print in bonds and compacts is about to change. And talk of vision or destiny should make you ask which experiments are being shut down to keep that vision intact. These cues turn spectacle into analysis. Extend the model to the scattering without overreaching predictions. When Leto dispersed humanity, he traded centralized control for survival through variance, betting that diversified communities would outlast any single failure. The Bene Gesserit and the Tleilaxu adapted by multiplying options, new bloodlines, new golas, new faces, to meet unfamiliar constraints. That choice kept memory, but refused stasis. It is a design lesson. Resilience prefers many small paths to one grand road. Notice how maintenance carries more power here than charisma. Contracts, routines, and small rituals make cooperation cheap day after day, preventing the need for constant theatrical rulership. Even the most sweeping vision relies on these daily meters. When they break, rulers learn that energy spent on symbols cannot replace missing plumbing. This helps explain why Herbert places so many pivotal shifts in boardrooms, caravanseries, and desert councils, rather than only on thrones. Bring it back to the promise of a power greater than any house. That greater power is not a person. It is the mesh of constraints, stories, structures, and time horizons that govern behavior. Charismatic figures can ride the mesh for a while, but the mesh sets their speed, their affordances, and their exits. Those who learn to edit the mesh, gently and early, shape outcomes that look like fate from the outside. Those who ignore it get fate handed back to them, loudly. So read Dune not as a contest for a seat, but as a practice of incentive design inside an evolving environment. In practice, victory looks like aligning tempo, belief, and institutional meters with a time plan that keeps optionality alive. Defeat looks like narrow certainty, brittle monopolies, and stories that demand too much policing to sustain. The lens is portable, and that is the point. Once you see the operating system, scenes stop being mysterious and start being legible. One last frame for difficult choices. The system rewards leaders who build slack, invite redundancy, and accept ecological truth as the boundary of ambition. It punishes those who aim for total clarity, total capture, or total purity. The price of distributed power is giving up some credit. The reward is that more people survive the shocks you cannot see. In Dune, power is a system of constraints and feedbacks. Durable control comes from shaping incentives across that system, not from seizing a symbol. Resources set tempo, beliefs set coordination speed, institutions meter conflict, and long plans edit the baseline. Once you watch for scarcity, legitimacy, ecology, and foresight traps, the saga's outcomes make clean sense. And the throne, impressive as it looks, becomes what it always was, a seat inside a moving machine.